Hi everyone, it's that time of year again. It is close to peak. And my team and myself have been working incredibly hard in preparing our platform to make sure it's ready. It's 100% ready for our customers during peak trading. If you take a look at previous years on our platform, you can see that we double, if not more than double, the amount of traffic on our platform during peak compared to quiet times during the rest of the year. And for many of our customers, this time of year is probably the most important time of year when it comes to revenues and being successful as a business. So it's critically important that we make sure our systems are 100%. So put it in perspective, last year we did over 500 billion requests for content objects. In the last 3 quarters of 2020, over 500 billion objects. So for us, it's always vitally important that we really focus on making sure the platform can scale to those kinds of volumes of traffic. So I thought I'd take the time on this video and give you an idea of what we do when we prepare for peak. I'm not going to go through all the little settings in Amazon. What I am going to do is give you a high-level view, a high-level process, something that might help you out if you're not doing this already, and I hope you find it useful. So let's not waste any more time, let's get to it. So when you start thinking of preparing for peak, a really good place to start is to have a workshop with all the people who build and run the system. These are the people who will really understand the nitty-gritty and the details of what's really going on. And the best question to ask is, what keeps them awake at night on the system? Because your team is in the best place to understand where there might be bottlenecks in the system and where there might be areas of the system that need improving, which might need a little treatment to make sure that it scales ready for peak. So if you're in the e-commerce sector, like most of us, you have a moratorium over peak period. In other words, you lock down the system and do no releases during that period. This is why one of the most important things you need to do when preparing for peak is to think about your product team and your release schedules. One of the things that we do is we go through our backlog and look for any technical debt items that may have an effect on performance, scalability, or on the reliability of the system. And when we've taken a look at those backlog items, we may then reset priorities and bring some technical debt forward. That's going to give us some comfort that the system is at its best during peak. The next thing you need to do in your product team is work with the operations team and make sure there are no upgrades or patches or system changes that may require your developers. Make sure you plan that work in ahead of time. And the final thing you should think about is, what are the up and coming things that you are releasing? And is it realistic that they're going to be released before you close down for peak? And if there are things that are going to miss that deadline, I'll often reallocate other features that I know are going to be released before peak so we can optimize the amount of value we give to customers before that deadline. There's no point working on a really nice big feature that's going to miss the deadline and won't be released till January, February time, when you can release a smaller feature that customers have been asking for and it might ease their workload during peak. And one last note on product planning. You should always make sure you've got a little bit of slack and flexibility in your product teams, because you never know what's going to crop up before peak that you might need to get onto, and you need developers to help fix it. So now let's talk about capacity planning. I bet that's what you thought I was going to talk about straight away, right? We are already changing the mix and the scheduling of servers and services right now on the platform. So what we do beyond that is to look at the historical patterns of traffic during the peak period and by how much does the traffic increase. And like I said, it's usually around double the amount of traffic overall, but there are lots of peaks and troughs. So we try to optimize the scheduling and the mix of those servers during those peaks and troughs. You should look at all the components in your system. Look at all of the stress points that there might be there in the system when it comes under load. So look at things like your data storage, your queuing systems and the capacity there. One of the other ways you might identify some pressure points in the system is by running some ceiling and some load testing. And things might pop up in places you just don't expect. So ultimately, what you're really doing is identifying where additional capacity is going to be needed during peak. So now you understand where you need capacity and where the stress points are in your system. Now's the time to start scaling the system. Now, there are 2 types of scaling measures that we use: predictive and automated. So predictive is what we were talking about. It's understanding your capacity requirements based on historical data and creating a new schedule for the future to deal with what you might predict those traffic patterns are going to be. Automation comes in to deal with unknowns. So you can never be 100% accurate because it is just a prediction. So what you need to do is set up the system so it can automatically scale. Now you might be asking me, well, why don't you just use automatic scaling? What I found is that just relying on automatic scaling is never enough. There's often a little lag time between the ramp up of services. Also, the quantum of scaling may be so high that the automation can't keep up fast enough. You may get a bit of jankiness, a bit of instability during the time of scaling. So if you use predictive and automated scaling correctly, you'll get a nice smooth scaling curve, and the service remains fully stable, fully performant, and no one actually knows that you've scaled at all. It just works. If you're using AWS like we are, they provide you with a load of tools to help you schedule the ramp up of your services based on time of day or particular days, as well as creating automation rules in application load balancers. So before we move on, can I ask you one favor? Can you reach over and click on the like button so that this video can be shared to many others? One of the most dangerous perceptions you can have when it comes to working on cloud environments is that you have an unlimited number of resources. Yes, it may feel like there are unlimited amount of resources, but during peak times, it may be that certain resources, like certain server types, might be very popular and therefore become more scarce. So one of the ways of combating that is to actually reserve the instances that you're going to need ahead of time. So what we often do is start reserving our Amazon instances in advance to make sure that we're going to have the capacity and we're going to have the server types that we actually use during peak. And on that, one of the other things you should do is to check your actual account headroom. So after going through all of the capacity requirements that you need and reserving the instances, it's always good to see what is the headroom you've actually got on your account, because it might be that you are reaching the limit to the number of instances you're allowed on your account. And it's really important that you go and talk to your supplier, whether it's Amazon or whether it's any other service, to make sure you get those limits addressed as soon as possible, because it may take time for them to do it. And you don't want to be doing that if you've hit a major incident because you don't have enough server capacity. One of the other ways of handling the scarcity problem of instances is to make sure your system can adapt to using different types of instances, and use things like your Amazon launch templates to launch your preferred instance, but if that's not available, it'll then take another instance or another instance type. And doing that means you have a much wider scope of resources you can use and will actually make your system far more reliable. Also, going back to limits, it's not just limited to instances. Those limits could be in services that you're using. They could be in appliances like databases that you're using from third parties. So you should review all of the services, all of the appliances that you're using, and look at all of the limits that are set for your account and request additional capacity if you need it as soon as possible. Another note on that is it might be a good time to look at your CDN commitments and see if you're going to have any overages. You know what your capacity requirements are, you've set up all of your scaling measures, and you've reserved instances. The next thing you should do is to look at running some fire tests. What I mean by that is to run some tests like ceiling tests on your environments when they're fully scaled. This ensures that you're not missing something. You're not missing some component in the back end you didn't consider. For instance, it's no point adding loads of additional server capacity if on Black Friday you find that you just don't have enough hard disk capacity. So a quick summary of the tests you should think about are ceiling tests, as I described, testing your systems at full capacity, do some disaster recovery testing, do some failover testing. Visibility is massively important in understanding how healthy your system is. During peak, it's critical to get your monitoring and your alarms right. Just like the rest of the system, the first thing you should do is to check to make sure that you have the capacity in your monitoring. There's no point if the monitoring of a system fails because you don't have enough capacity when the whole point of it in the first place is to check to see if it's running at high load. It's also worth taking time and looking to make sure that you've got monitoring and alarms in place in all of the stress points in your system, because if you're like we are, you've added new features and new functionality. So therefore, you've got to make sure that monitoring is in place to deal with new aspects of the system and new profiles of the system. The number one thing is to make sure that you have the monitors and alarms in place to find out where your system is feeling the most stress. Most modern systems these days are using more than one supplier. It's always worth reaching out to your suppliers and letting them know how much load they should be expecting from you to make sure that they can do their own capacity planning also. And the sort of suppliers you should look for are things like your CDN provider, your infrastructure provider, any third-party services such as databases. Really any supplier that is a dependency on ensuring your system is performing and scaling correctly. Now, the final thing you need to consider are the people who are going to be running the system. You should have a visible roster of people who will be covering out-of-hours support. And make sure you've got all the resources you need available, not just support and operations and DevOps, but also developers you may need on call, and escalation paths to senior management and execs. And one final thing around people and coverage. Given the current situation that we've been with COVID, you may want to put additional plans in place to cover any employees that unfortunately may become unwell. When it comes down to systems, for me, a successful peak is an uneventful peak. But to achieve that, it requires a fair amount of work. And like I said before, that work will carry you through for the rest of the year. I'm expecting some really big numbers on the platform this year, not only because of digital being a primary channel, and also we've had some very big customers on the platform who I hope are going to have a very successful peak. I hope you found this video useful. It wasn't too rudimentary and it didn't feel like I was trying to teach you to suck eggs. I know that many of our customers are already doing some of these measures. They've already reached out to me as a supplier and asking many of the questions I've put in this video. But hopefully there are some things you can take away from this and make sure that your peak is just as uneventful as ours is going to be. If there are things that you guys are doing out there that I've missed that's really important, love to hear about them. Please put them in the comments. And if you like this video, can you reach down and click on the like button, please? But for now, it's time to say thank you, goodbye, and I'll see you next time.